What does invalidate mean in "this did not include these invalidated home"? This context comes from the book Black Rednecks and White Liberals. The heavy drain, physical and mental, in keeping squadrons on the East African coast was reflected in the loss of 282 officers and men in the 10 years 1875 to 85, and this did not include these invalidated home. Consider these three definitions. To make invalid, nullify. American Heritage Registered Trademark Symbol Dictionary. Uchinic Invalida, ling.pl. This is a definition from a Polish dictionary I'm using which says, make someone an invalid. I wasn't able to find a corresponding definition in English with invalid as in disabled person. Although I found this definition in Merriam-Webster which pretty much covers it. To make invalid. Especially, to weaken or destroy the cogency of. Does the sentence in question mean that the loss of 282 officers and men in the 10 years 1875 to 85 did not include these which became cripples during their work and returned home, or the count did not include the people who died at home as a result of heavy physical and mental drain during the service because someone deemed them invalid to be included in the count?
I've never heard that use, but it may be another way of saying invalided out, which I take to mean removed from the field of battle due to an injury. It may be only used in British English and has a World War I feel to it. A web search gives this from Longman's dictionary. Be invalided out, also be invalided home. British English to have to leave the army, navy etc. because you are ill or injured.
It means that the number of officers lost which is mentioned in this passage, 282, did not include those who were sent home because they were made invalid by military conflicts. Invalidate seems indeed to be a variant of the verb invalid here. Wikipedia has a note about a British officer, which says, William Lawford, 1809–1812, wounded and invalidated home during the siege of Ciudad Rodrigo. When you click on his name, you find a post which contains this sentence. On his first experience of battle, a relatively minor engagement in the Pyrenees, Girdwood suffers a complete mental breakdown and is invalided home. The ard which you quote in your op has this definition of invalid as a verb. Chiefly British, to release or exempt from duty because of ill health. I was not quite sick enough to be invalided out, even though I was of no more use. Mary Lee Settle.
Invalidated in this context is a rare synonym for disabled, used particularly of soldiers. Someone who is disabled by injury is an invalid, in American English, pronounced differently from the adjective that means not valid, with the stress on the first syllable and the vowel of the second syllable reduced. This sense of invalidated seems to be primarily from what is now the Commonwealth, in the early 20th century. Google Grams shows that the phrase, invalidated soldiers, peaks at the height of the First World War. The handful of later instances are mostly from history books, and it is not common enough in the American English corpus to be indexed. I also cannot find any usages of civilians being invalidated by accident or illness. I have never heard invalidated used that way in modern English, but Google knows of at least one example of it being used in American English, in the proceedings of the National Conference of Social Work in 1970. Some examples, with emphasis added, from Canada. Many ex-soldiers returned from Europe disabled and unfit to farm. Finding work could be very difficult for disabled veterans, though this issue was not ignored. A 1918 circular by the Invalidated Soldiers Commission was published in Ottawa with the aim of providing guidance on how to reintegrate these men into the workforce. St. Vincent and the Grenadines, also describing the armistice in 1918. On the day of the official celebrations, peace bonfires were lit at 8 p.m. at different points from Fancy to Union Island. On July 24th, invalidated soldiers were given 5 shillings and the destitute poor 2 shillings. And New Zealand in 1940. A statement concerning the government's treatment of soldiers invalidated from overseas was made today by Hon. Mr. Jones. Full provision has been made for the treatment and rehabilitation of men when they return, including medical, boarding and classification treatment where necessary, pay and pension while in hospital, provision of eligible clothing allowance, traveling warrants, etc.
The rest of the paragraph, specifically the next sentence, gives context and makes the meaning fairly clear. The heavy drain, physical and mental, in keeping squadrons on the East African coast was reflected in the loss of 282 officers and men in the 10 years 1875 to 85, and this did not include these invalidated home. Navy personnel, racked by fever, sunstroke and dysentery, were forced to retire prematurely and live on a small pittance. Invalidated home means sent home due to illness because they were incapable of duty.
If you want to support the channel, please consider liking and subscribing.